We lied to you, or did we? For years, we've been saying that our method isn't about intervals. But what if it actually is? What if everything we've said was a lie, and all those success stories fake? What if we're just scammers? Well, in this video, you're going to find out the truth, because maybe we have been lying. Or maybe everyone else has. If you're new here, I am Leonardo, creator of Use Your Ear, a science-based ear training method designed to help musicians deeply connect with the essence of music, feeling. Unlike traditional methods that can lead to overthinking, this approach focuses on making ear training intuitive and practical for real musical situations. So far, we've helped over 2,000 musicians who have embraced this approach and rated it as excellent on Trustpilot. Today, this method is used by professional musicians and music educators in leading music colleges and universities, including Wits University in Johannesburg, ranked among the top 3 universities in South Africa. In the past months, we have received a few comments that I'd like to address. Let's start with this one. So, it is an intervallic approach, but you compare it to the root, tonic I would say, of the expected key instead of each pair of notes. Well, my answer is no, not at all. And here's why. If you're thinking in intervals, you're neglecting the most important component of how we naturally hear music, our perception of the tonal framework. Scientific studies like those by Butler and Brown and Carol Cromansel confirm that our brain automatically perceives tonality even when we hear just 1 or 2 notes inside our head. This means that when we recognize notes, we aren't just measuring distances between them. We are recognizing how the notes feel inside the tonality we hear in our minds. This tonality isn't always the same as the song's actual key. It's the one our brain perceives. In the beginning, the perception of the tonality is very often unstable or different from the song's true tonality. And this is the number one problem to solve. You should first stabilize the perception of the tonality. Otherwise, this will totally prevent you from developing intuitive ear training skills, where you recognize notes and chords based on feeling. The problem with focusing on intervals is that it means you're not making the perception of tonality your top priority. And when this isn't your main focus, it's almost inevitable that you run into obstacles that will hinder your ear training progress. You're overlooking the single most important aspect of music perception. It's like driving without a license. You might get away with it for a while, maybe even cover some distance. But sooner or later, you'll get stopped, and it'll cost you. Let's see a practical example of a typical issue of thinking of intervals to the tonic. Let's say you're recognizing a melody like 4-3-5 in a key. If you think about it in intervals, you might calculate the interval from the tonic to 4, then the interval from the tonic to 3, and then the interval from the tonic to 5, right? But this doesn't mean that the pitch corresponding to the tonic actually feels like the tonic in your mind. My key question is, how do you even know if you're perceiving the tonic correctly? If your perception of the tonality shifts to a different key, as it often happens, you might unknowingly start hearing 4 as the new tonic. This means that instead of hearing 1-4, you now hear 5-1 without realizing it. This shift happens all the time for beginners. All the time. It's a very, very common issue. So you're still hearing the same notes, the same exact pitches, but they now feel completely different in the new perceived tonal context. The big problem is that if your tonal center keeps shifting, you can't reliably associate scale degrees with their feelings. The same degree will feel different every time, and that makes learning nearly impossible. This is the single biggest issue beginners face in ear training. And this shift of the tonality doesn't just happen with 1-4. It can happen with 1-5 as well, and many other intervals. Even perceiving 6 as the major key tonic instead of 1 is pretty common initially. This is why developing a stable perception of the tonality is the foundation of our ear training method. Thinking in terms of intervals to the tonic doesn't fix this problem. If anything, it makes it even worse and creates other problems on top of it, as we're going to see next. Here's another comment that I see a lot. I think the phrasing that it's not about intervals, but feeling is misleading, because that feeling does partially derive from intervals. When you compare a note's feeling in relation to a tonal center, that itself uses an interval. So the truth is that it's a combination of intervals and the tonal center that you're basing them on that creates a given feeling. I think you should try to be more clear about this instead of using intervals to mean intervals without context. I understand what you're saying here, but the way the statement is framed, saying that the feeling of a note is a combination of the interval and the tonal center, is actually very misleading and unclear for most people. It's misleading for a variety of reasons, which I'm about to explain next. Unfortunately, this statement is a symptom of a much bigger language problem. Many great musicians we've tested say they think in intervals, but when we actually analyze what they do, they are not calculating intervals at all. They are identifying notes and chords based on the feelings they have within the tonality, exactly like we teach. So definitely, we need to use words carefully here, because many musicians are being misled by this. A much more accurate way to describe the origin of the feeling of notes is saying that the feeling of a note comes from its role within the perceived tonality. So here are the reasons why the statement included in the comment is misleading. First of all, mentioning the word interval is extremely misleading and doesn't describe what actually happens in our mind. Why? Because for someone who hasn't developed this skill yet, hearing the word interval immediately makes them think of distances. That's just how our brain processes the word. It implies measurement, as if the important thing is the gap between the two notes. But in reality, both the distance and the gap are completely irrelevant. Let's never forget that you can't recognize music by thinking in distances. The only way our brain can interpret music is through feelings. We don't perceive any distance from a musical piece. We only perceive sounds and feelings. So a much better way is to think about it like gravity. On Earth, we experience a certain gravitational pull. But if we were on the moon, the pull would be much weaker. The same thing happens with notes inside a tonal framework. If you change the context, so if your perception of the tonality shifts, the same note will suddenly feel completely different, just like gravity changes based on which planet you're on. This parallel implies that your focus should be on the note itself, rather than the gap between the tonic and the note. Which brings me to a second very important reason why that statement is misleading. If you can recognize notes intuitively, you know that the intervals from the tonal center to the note isn't really an interval in your head. You aren't focusing on the gap. Supposing you are following our method properly, what you're actually doing is experiencing the feeling of the note within the tonality. Your attention is only on the note you're recognizing. You are feeling the note as part of the entire tonal framework and feeling its gravitational pull. Whereas using the word interval implies that you compare two notes instead of simply recognizing the one you need. This is to say that rather than focusing on each note as it comes, this type of interval thinking constantly shifts your attention between the tonic and the target note. And this makes the process highly inefficient and not as intuitive as it could and should be. This is not how we teach ear training. After you're properly trained with our method, you can recognize notes and chords without even worrying about the tonic. We've seen countless students develop this skill successfully. This might seem like a small distinction, but focus is everything in ear training. One of the biggest reasons why our method is so effective is that it guides you through developing a structured thought process for each ear training task. This level of detail is why musicians say our method is a game changer, even for those previously trained in other tonal approaches like solfege or functional ear training. A third reason why linking a note's feeling to its interval from the tonic is misleading is that it causes students to mix together the two different approaches, thinking in scale degrees and thinking in intervals, which creates a lot of issues. Why? First, your thought process becomes confused and inefficient because you don't have a clear strategy on how to perform ear training tasks. Second, you lose the tonic more often because thinking in terms of intervals encourages you to shift the perceived tonality without realizing it, as I've explained at the beginning of the video. 3. This makes it difficult to associate the feeling of each note with its correct scale degree, preventing you from developing intuitive ear training skills, as the tonal shifts interfere with forming consistent note feeling to scale degree associations. Fourth, every time you think in intervals, instead of focusing only on the specific note you have to recognize, you divide your focus across unnecessary notes, leading to mental overload. This overwhelms your memory, causing you to forget the notes you originally needed to recognize. To summarize, this mixed approach creates a negative feedback loop. More thinking involved leads to more confusion, which overloads your memory, making you forget notes. As a result, your ability to recognize notes declines significantly, no matter your skill level. So interval-based thinking remains inefficient even when calculating intervals from the tonic. I've seen advanced musicians struggle with this approach because it disrupts intuitive recognition. The moment they stop relying on intervals and fully embrace tonal perception, their ear training improves very quickly. If you've made it this far, you're probably realizing that the details of how we approach ear training matter much more than they might seem at first. And if you want to experience this shift firsthand, we invite you to join our free workshop. In this 3-hour session, we'll break down exactly how to unlock your musical ear, using a science-based, step-by-step method that has helped thousands of musicians recognize notes and chords by ear intuitively. You'll also learn how to avoid the most common ear training mistakes and focus on the right exercises for your skill level, so you can improve faster and without frustration. The workshop is free for now, but we can't guarantee it will remain free forever. If you're serious about transforming your musical ear, click the link in the description below, register now, and start seeing results right away. If you're not ready for the workshop yet, check out this video where I walk you through my step-by-step process for helping musicians identify chords by ear intuitively.